Scott Miller has been my biggest rival for a decade. He's arrogant, ruthless, and just stole the promotion of my dreams. But when my apartment floods, he's the only person with a spare room. Now, Anna is living with the enemy, and the way Scott looks at me across the kitchen table makes me think he's been planning this all along. The universe has a twisted sense of humor. I stood in my hallway, watching a literal waterfall cascade from my ceiling onto my professional portfolio. My laptop was fried, my sketches for the Sovereign project were pulp, and every hotel in a 5-mile radius was booked solid for the tech convention. I had exactly one person I could call, even if the thought made me want to scream. Scott Miller, my rival since college. The man who sat in the office next to mine and spent his days outmaneuvering me for the senior partner title at our firm. When he opened the door to his penthouse, he wasn't wearing his usual $3,000 suit. He was in gray sweatpants and a t-shirt that hugged his chest far too well. He leaned against the frame, a slow, smug smirk spreading across his face as he looked at my dripping suitcase and my ruined hair. "Anna," he purred, his voice a low, dark baritone that vibrated in my chest. "Come to finally admit my designs are better, or did you just miss the sight of my face?" "My ceiling fell in, Scott. It's a literal disaster zone. I need a place for 48 hours until the insurance adjuster shows up. Don't make it weird, and don't make me regret this more than I already do." I tried to sound professional, but my voice cracked. He stepped back, gesturing for me to enter his minimalist, cold palace. The place was all glass, steel, and expensive silence. "The guest room is at the end of the hall. But one rule, stay out of my office. I won't have you spying on my sovereign blueprints while I'm sleeping." "I'd rather eat glass than look at your derivative work," I snapped. But as I brushed past him, the heat radiating from his body made my skin prickle. For 10 years, we had fought over blueprints, awards, and promotions. We had been the two suns in a very small solar system, always trying to outshine the other. Now, the gravity had shifted. We were trapped in the same room, and the air already felt too thin. I walked toward the guest room, feeling his eyes on my back, wondering if I had just walked into a different kind of trap entirely. I couldn't sleep. The guest room was too quiet, and the scent of Scott, sandalwood, and expensive leather seemed to permeate the very walls. I wandered into the kitchen at 2:00 a.m. for water, only to find him standing by the island, staring at the rain-streaked window. He looked different in the dark, less like a shark and more like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. He pushed a glass of wine toward me before I could even speak. "The bed's not comfortable," he asked, his voice rough with fatigue. "It's fine, I'm just stressed. Everything I've worked for is under a layer of drywall mud right now." He turned then, and the dim under-cabinet lighting cast sharp shadows across his jawline. He took a slow sip of his own drink, his eyes never leaving mine. "You're a lot of things, Anna, but you're not a quitter. Why haven't you asked me for help with your portfolio? I know the board is meeting on Friday." "Because you'd use it against me. You'd find every flaw and parade it in front of the partners to secure your own spot. We aren't friends, Scott. We're competitors." Scott took a step closer, his presence overwhelming the small space between us. "I don't need to find flaws to beat you. I've beaten you plenty of times on merit alone." He paused, his gaze softening in a way that made my heart stutter. "But I also know that your brain works in ways mine doesn't. You've been fighting me for so long you forgot how it feels to have someone actually see the work you put in. I see you, Anna. I see how hard you work." I felt the air leave the room. He was so close I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. For a moment, the rivalry felt like a thin veil that could be torn with a single word. I reached for the glass he offered, but our fingers brushed, and a jolt of electricity surged up my arm, making my breath hitch. I didn't drink the wine. I fled back to my room, my heart hammering a rhythm I didn't recognize, terrified that the enemy was starting to feel like home. I woke up to the sound of Scott on a high-stakes conference call. He was ruthless, cutting through a client's excuses like a knife through silk. It was the version of him I hated, the one that always won. While he was in the shower, I found myself standing in front of his office door. The door he told me was strictly off-limits. I told myself I was looking for a charger. I told myself I was looking for a pen. I was lying to myself, and I knew it. I needed to know what he was hiding. I slipped inside. His desk was covered in sketches, but they weren't for the Sovereign project. They were old, yellowed at the edges. I recognized the style immediately. It was my style. He had saved my old university designs, the ones from our junior year that I thought had been thrown away years ago. There were notes in the margins in his handwriting, praising the structural integrity and the aesthetic choices. Find what you were looking for. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Scott stood in the doorway, a towel slung low on his hips, his skin still damp from the shower. He didn't look angry, he looked caught, exposed in a way that terrified him. "Why do you have these?" I whispered, my voice trembling as I held up a sketch of a library I'd designed when I was 20. He walked toward me, the air turning heavy and humid. He didn't stop until I was backed against the heavy mahogany desk. "Because you were always the best, Anna. I didn't save them to study your weaknesses. I saved them because they reminded me why I started doing this in the first place." He placed his hands on the desk on either side of me, trapping me in the circle of his scent and heat. "I've spent 10 years trying to be your equal, not your enemy. But you wouldn't let me in unless I was fighting you." He leaned down, his breath warm against my ear, sending shivers down my spine. "Are we still fighting, Anna? Or are you finally going to admit that you feel this too?" The storm that flooded my place wasn't finished with the city yet. A massive crack of thunder shook the penthouse, vibrating the glass walls, and the lights flickered twice before dying completely. Total darkness. The city lights below vanished into the gray rain, leaving us isolated in the sky. I froze. I've hated the dark since I was a child, a remnant of a bad memory I usually kept buried under layers of logic. "Anna," Scott's voice was sharp with immediate concern. "Over here," I called out, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. I felt him move through the room with the precision of someone who knew every inch of his space. A flash of lightning illuminated him standing just inches from me. Without a word, he reached out and took my hand. His palm was broad and warm, his grip steadying. He led me to the oversized sofa by the window. "Stay with me," he whispered. We sat together on the floor, watching the chaos of the storm outside. For hours, the barriers we had built over a decade crumbled. He told me about the crushing pressure his father put on him to be a legacy. I told him about my fear of being forgotten in a sea of mediocre architects. The Scott Miller the world knew, the cold, calculating shark, was gone. In the dark, he was just a man who was tired of being alone at the top. "I don't hate you," I admitted, my voice barely audible over the rain. "I think I was just scared of how much I admired you." "I know," he replied, his voice a low vibration next to me. He shifted, his face inches from mine in the shadows. "That's the problem. Hatred is easy, it's a shield. This honesty is much harder. It makes us vulnerable." He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, and for the first time in 10 years, I didn't pull away. I leaned into the touch, wondering if the storm outside was nothing compared to the one brewing between us. The storm didn't let up, and neither did the tension that had been building for years. We moved from the floor to his bedroom, the silence between us heavy with everything we hadn't said. The lightning outside cast long, flickering shadows as Scott pulled me into him, his hands finding the small of my back with a desperate familiarity. "This changes everything," he warned, his voice raspy and thick with emotion. "There's no going back to just being rivals after this, Anna. If we do this, I'm not letting you go back to hating me tomorrow morning." "I know," I breathed, reaching up to tangle my fingers in his dark hair. When we made love that night, it wasn't a game or a conquest. It was a collision of years of repressed desire and unspoken respect. He moved with a possessive, fierce tenderness that left me feeling completely seen. Every touch felt like a question he had been waiting a decade to ask, and every kiss was an answer I finally had the courage to give. It was intense, emotional, and raw. In the quiet aftermath, tangled in his expensive sheets, I felt a peace I hadn't known since I entered this industry. I fell asleep thinking the rivalry was dead. But as the sun began to rise, casting a cold gray light into the room, I saw a folder on his nightstand that hadn't been there before. It was the official, sovereign contract, embossed with the company seal. I opened it with trembling fingers. It was signed and dated 3 days ago. He hadn't been fighting me for the promotion this week. He had already won it before I even knocked on his door. He had let me stay, let me cry, and let me love him, all while holding the one thing I wanted most in the world behind his back. I sat up, the cold morning air hitting my bare skin like a physical blow. The warmth of the night before vanished instantly. "You already have it," I said, my voice flat. "The Sovereign Project. You've had the contract since Monday." Scott stayed still for a long second before opening his eyes slowly. He saw me holding the folder and didn't try to hide it. "Anna, listen to me. It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think. You let me move in. You let me talk about my dreams, you let me. You let me fall for you, all while knowing you'd already won the prize. Was this a victory lap for you? Betting the loser to make the win feel even sweeter?" I was shouting now, the tears of anger stinging my eyes. "Don't you dare," Scott snapped, throwing back the covers and standing up. He looked powerful, even in the morning light, but his face was etched with pain. "I didn't tell you because I knew you react like this. I wanted 48 hours where we were just people, not employees competing for a title. I wanted to see if there was anything left of us besides the competition." "We are the competition, Scott. That's all we've ever been. You didn't want a person, you wanted a trophy to go along with your new office." I dressed with shaking hands, every movement feeling like a betrayal of the intimacy we'd shared hours ago. The one bed wasn't a romance, it was a cage. "I'm leaving, and don't worry about the Sovereign Project. You can have it. You've clearly sacrificed everything else for it anyway." I grabbed my bag and walked out, the sound of my heels echoing like gunshots in the hallway, leaving behind the only man I'd ever truly loved and the biggest mistake of my life. 6 months later, the Sovereign Center was having its grand unveiling, a glittering event for the elite of the architectural world. I was there as a guest of a rival firm, wearing a dress that felt like armor. I hadn't spoken to Scott since that morning in his penthouse. I had watched from a distance as he took the lead, his name appearing in every trade magazine. Scott was on stage, looking every bit the triumphant CEO. But as I watched him speak, I realized he looked thinner, his eyes hollow and devoid of the spark they usually held when we were arguing. The crowd was cheering, but the atmosphere changed abruptly when Marcus, a developer Scott had fired months ago for unethical practices, stood up at the back of the room, holding a tablet high. "A toast to the thief," Marcus shouted, his voice amplified by the silence of the room. "I have the internal security logs from Miller's private server. Scott Miller didn't design this building. He stole the core concepts, the structural integrity, the aesthetic flow, from Anna Vance's private files while she was staying at his penthouse. I have the timestamps to prove he accessed her cloud drive during that storm." The room went silent. The press surged forward, cameras flashing like 1,000 strobe lights. I felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't just drama, this was career suicide for both of us. If people believed I'd been robbed, Scott was finished. If they believed I'd let him take it, I was finished. I looked at Scott on the stage. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked straight at me, his expression unreadable, as his entire world began to crumble around him. Scott didn't look at Marcus, and he didn't look at the security guards rushing toward the stage. He looked straight at me, standing in the middle of the ballroom. He walked back to the microphone, his expression completely calm, almost relieved. "Marcus is right about one thing," Scott said, his voice echoing with a strange, haunting clarity. "The brilliance of this building, the soul of it, belongs to Anna Vance, but I didn't steal it." He pulled a document from his inner jacket pocket, something he'd clearly been carrying for a long time. 6 months ago. Before this project even broke ground, I filed a legal patent for a joint ownership structure. I didn't sign the Sovereign contract as Scott Miller. I signed it as Miller and Vance. I've been waiting for Anna to be ready to sign her half. I didn't steal her ideas. I tried to protect them because I knew she was too proud to take the win if she thought I'd handed it to her. He turned to the board members in the front row, his voice hardening. "If you don't want a joint venture, then you don't want me. I resign as senior partner, effective immediately. I hand all my shares, all my credit, and all my future royalties of the Sovereign Project to Anna. She's the only one who can finish what we started. I'm done." The room erupted into absolute chaos. Marcus was escorted out, screaming, but I couldn't move. Scott walked off the stage, ignored the reporters, and walked right past me toward the exit. He had given it all up. The title, the money, the reputation he'd spent a decade building. He had destroyed his career to save mine. I realized then that the contract on his nightstand wasn't a betrayal. It was a placeholder he was holding for me. I found him back at the penthouse. He wasn't packed, and he wasn't angry. He was sitting on the same bar stool where we'd shared that silent glass of wine 6 months ago. The city lights were bright behind him, but he looked like he finally had nothing left to lose. "You're a fool, Scott Miller," I said, my voice echoing in the minimalist space. "Maybe, but I'm a fool who can finally sleep at night," he said, turning to look at me. "I spent 10 years trying to stay ahead of you because I thought that was the only way you'd respect me. I realized that morning you left. I didn't want your respect if I didn't have your heart." I walked toward him, the distance between us closing for the final time. "You gave up everything. Why?" He stood up, pinning me against the marble island, just like he had in his office. "Because I told you. I'm tired of winning if it means you lose. I don't want to be the best architect in the city if you aren't the one standing in the office next to mine. I love you, Anna. I've probably loved you since that first critique in sophomore year when you told me my rafters were pretentious." I reached out, my fingers tracing the line of his jaw, feeling the warmth of the man I had tried so hard to hate. "I signed the papers, Scott, but I made one change. It's not Miller and Vance. It's Vance and Miller. I get the corner office with the view of the park." He laughed, a rich, genuine sound that broke the last of the tension between us. "Deal, as long as I get to be the one who takes you home every night." He kissed me then, and it wasn't a battle, it was a surrender. A year later, the city's skyline looked different. The Vance and Miller building stood tall, a gleaming monument of glass and steel that had won every award in the book. It was a testament to what happens when two rivals stop trying to destroy each other and start trying to build something together. We were back in the penthouse, but the restricted office was now a shared studio, filled with both of our sketches and a very messy drafting table. The guest room, that was now a nursery, painted in soft tones that didn't feel minimalist or cold at all. Scott was behind me, his arms wrapped securely around my waist as we looked out at the building we'd created. "You know," I whispered, leaning back into his chest, "I still think my design for the roof garden was more innovative than your glass atrium." Scott turned me around, a wicked, familiar glint in his eyes. "Oh, we're back to the rivalry, are we? I seem to remember a certain lead architect promising to behave after the wedding ceremony." "I never promised to be boring, Scott. That's why you married me." He leaned down, kissing me with a depth and a promise that told me the one-bed rule was now a lifetime contract. "Good, because I have a new project I want to pitch to you. It's a multi-year commitment with a very high ROI. "Does it involve blueprints?" I asked, smiling against his lips. "No," he smirked, picking me up and carrying me toward our room, the same way he'd carried the weight of our rivalry for so long. "It involves a lot of overtime, zero competition, and a very satisfying ending." The rivalry was over, the partnership was forever, and as it turned out, having my rival as my roommate was the most beautiful design I ever made.